Hello and welcome to the Lockton Marine Podcast. My name is Langeland, Johannessen. I'm the head of special risks at Lockton Marine. And in this podcast series, we will have an in-depth look at a variety of marine insurance topics. And we will do our very best to make that more entertaining than it sounds on paper. I'm joined today by Nick Wilmot, marine insurance legend and consultant/oracle here at Lockton Marine. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you very much. Always good to be here.
In this particular episode, we are going to look at marine business interruption, and we are going to try and view that particular topic through the lens of the Baltimore Bridge incident, as this is a great illustration of the scope and the limitation of standard insurances, but also the opportunities that come with non-standard solutions. So we'll start with a quick recap. On the 26th of March, the vessel Dali ran into the Francis Scott Key Bridge, causing it to collapse, resulting in loss of life, massive property damage, and the blockage of shipping in and out of the port of Baltimore, which largely continues to this day. Now, there are numerous insurance considerations that we could have spent hours discussing in relation to the incident, most prominently the loss of life, the liability, etc. But we are focusing today on what it tells us about business interruption for the vessels involved. Ready?
Yep.
Good. So for the purpose of this discussion, Nick, I think it would be useful to look at this in terms of three different scenarios. A, the vessel's stuck inside of the port, unable to get out. We have B, the vessels that cannot enter the port. And we have C, the vessel stuck in the middle, the vessel causing the blockage. And we're going to start with A. So these are the vessels that can't leave the port because there's a physical hindrance. In this case, there's a vessel and there's a bridge that has collapsed, blocking the shipping channel. These vessels have loaded or discharged cargo or passengers, for that matter. They are not damaged and they now have nowhere to go. And in the process, revenue is lost. So in your learned opinion, which insurance would respond to this?
Well, for these vessels, we do have specific cover. And the cover is provided by standard loss of hire, at least if it's on Chapter 16 of the Nordic Plan. And when we were drafting those conditions, one of the natural additions that was included to standard loss of hire, which is basically designed to cover damage to the loss of income due to damage to the vessel. One of the first things that was thought of as a necessary addition was this case of a vessel that is blocked and trapped, was the expression that came to be used. That a vessel that was stuck in a port or some other limited area and unable to leave because of matters that had nothing to do with the vessel itself, but because of some physical obstruction. Not strikes, not bad weather, but some physical obstruction. And the first example was that what if the entrance to a port was blocked by a vessel that sank or collided or something or ran aground? And having identified that issue, the next one that was raised by somebody was, well, what if a bridge collapses and closes the port? And so the Nordic Plan specifically includes cover for this type of event.
Right. And so you make the reference to blocking and trapping, which people normally think of in a war-like context. Yeah. So what you're saying is that the traditional Nordic Plan marine loss of hire extends beyond hull damages to a sort of marine blocking and trapping.
Yeah. And blocking and trapping first came into focus during one of the Gulf Wars because of the number of vessels were trapped in the Gulf and were unable to leave because of the war situation. And so blocking and trapping is an essential part of war insurance, but it can also apply outside of war, and that's why it's covered now in both cases.
one thing that's interesting in this context is who pays for this, or who actually loses the money, whether this is a charterer's risk or an owner's risk, but someone carries the risk and someone has an insurable interest.
And this is a good way of also illustrating how insurance is a risk management mechanism that you use once you have decided or to pick up the risks that have been allocated to the parties to the contract. So a time charter party allocates risks between the owner and the charter in a specific way. And then that in turn has consequences of who needs insurance to protect those risks that have been allocated to the charter on the one hand and the ship owner on the other. And in this particular case, if you had a time-chartered vessel stuck inside the port, the time charter would still have to pay his monthly hire unless the delay was so substantial in relation to the time charter period that he could say that, oh, this is a case of frustration, which again would depend on the law applicable to the time charter party. So those are the sort of things that you have to keep in mind.
And then there are vessels for which this is much easier discussion. If you're a cruise vessel, for instance, this is all the owner's risk.
Yeah. Or if you were a liner vessel.
Exactly. If I remember correctly, the definition within the plan for this scenario is if the vessel is prevented from leaving a port or a similar area. In your opinion, how stringent is that interpretation of what a port or a similar area means? Let's imagine this happened not in a port directly, but in a river or a canal where a retreat or a removal is difficult.
No, I think the intention was to provide cover in any case where the use of the vessel is restricted or taken away for a period because it can't access its normal scheduled route. And so it was deliberate not to restrict it to a port, but to any similar kind of limited area where a vessel could be stuck for a while. And so it applies to canals and rivers and any area where for some reason you can be physically restrained. That's good enough.
I think for underwriters and even for owners, there's an element of aggregation looking at a scenario like this, because if you're unlucky, or if this happens somewhere where you trade frequently enough, you could have a number of vessels stuck inside of a port or a similar area.
But yes, you think of the Suez Canal, and if the Suez Canal is blocked at one end, then the ships that are prevented from going through for a long period of time. I would say that the plan should apply to that case as well for those ships that are physically detained from going through the canal, and therefore their only alternative is to go around Africa.
Well, let's imagine that that's the case. So the Suez Canal is blocked. There's a physical hindrance, a vessel, which happened only a few years ago.
Yes,
so we've actually seen it.
Yeah.
And you are insured for loss of hire under the plan. And let's imagine that your interpretation is right, which I have no reason to doubt.
Well, there might be insurers who would disagree.
And instead of waiting around, being quote unquote stuck, you do incur the contingency cost of going around to get to where you need to go. Is that conceivably recoverable as a sue and labor expense?
Well, in order to be sue and labor, it has to be reasonable. And the costs, and this is where, there's an element of evaluation, because costs of going around compared to the cost of, they could be huge. And again, the question is, what's the situation under the charter party?
Moving on to what we labeled scenario B, where we have a number of vessels waiting to get into the port, where they may have a COA to deliver a cargo at a specific location, a specific factory or refinery or whatever it may be, or it could be one of the scheduled ports on a cruise. Would their loss of time be covered under the same provisions that we've just outlined under standard loss of hire?
No, it wouldn't be covered by the loss of hire. Because, put it this way, if you look at the world, the globe as a whole, there's only a tiny part of the globe that they're unable to access. The rest, they are free to to travel to. Whereas the situation envisaged in the loss of hire conditions is the exact opposite. You're stuck in a little area and the rest of the world is closed to you.
But these vessels will still likely incur some form of losses, right? There's going to be time lost, waiting, and once they're done waiting, they might incur contingency costs going other places to discharge or load. Would this fall under the remit of, say, a delay or a trade disruption insurance rather than loss of hire?
If you were going to cover this risk, you would need some kind of, and I think trade disruption is the best expression. So you would need to have a policy that specifically addressed this issue.
And I suspect it's largely going to be a case of contingency cost rather than lost time, because you will eventually
you will have to find some alternative way of dealing with the situation. Cruise vessels who are unable to access a particular port, that's a good example. But you can also have vessels that are basically a shuttle between two ports, delivering, for example, gas between port A and port B on a regular shuttle basis. If one of the ports is closed, then you're going to need some specific tailor-made cover for that situation.
To scenario C, where we're talking about the vessel causing the blockage. Quite clearly, the time this vessel loses in salvage, general average, or repairs is recovered by a standard loss of hire. That's what loss of hire is for.
That's what it's for, yeah.
But what I want to talk about in this context is what happens if the vessel suffers only minimal damage, that it could very soon be technically able to leave, but it's held because there's an investigation, there's an anticipation of a security, there's a discussion whether that security is acceptable, and based on the jurisdiction, this could be extremely time-consuming. And we've seen cases where the time relating to the physical loss could even be below deductible, where we're talking about weeks and months where they're just being held. To what extent do you consider this to be covered by your standard loss of hire?
Well, in principle, to start with that, in principle, you would say that delay which is solely caused by, let's say, the authorities restraining the vessel for investigations, or while the P&I Club is providing security, in those cases, there wouldn't be cover. That's not the purpose of loss of hire insurance. Standard loss of hire insurance is there to cover the loss of income due to physical damage. But on the other hand, a reasonable loss of hire insurer has to accept that in any incident where there's damage, there's also likely to be some kind of necessary investigation. There'll be some inevitable delays due to the damage itself while authorities are investigating and so on. So a certain amount of time can be added into the loss of hire. But once it becomes clear that the sole reason why the vessel is being restrained is because the authorities are investigating potential liability and things of that nature, then you're outside traditional loss of hire.
And once you're outside of traditional loss of hire, again, the question becomes...
Or standard loss of hire.
Standard, yes. So the question then becomes, where can you cover this eventuality?
And relatively simple matter to extend standard loss of hire to include this kind of event where, and the most typical examples where a vessel is involved in a pollution incident, being the worst type of situation where you're likely to can easily be delayed for a long period of time. And so you can add on this kind of risk to a standard loss of hire, the so-called extended loss of hire. That kind of cover is available.
If we're lucky enough to have any ship owners listening to us, they've now heard this, and they hear that there are, just in this one incident, there are 3 potential loss scenarios for their vessels. And we've talked about a number of different insurances. So we've talked about loss of hire, we've talked about extended loss of hire, we talked about delay and trade disruption. How do they bring these all together?
Well, I think if you're looking at it from a ship owner's point of view, or their advisors, then this is where you're having a sort of holistic risk management perspective on things is important. Even though it's very easy, especially if you're an insurance manager, to think in terms of, okay, I have hull and machinery, I have loss of hire, and I have P&I, and I've got to take out those kind of insurances. But if you look at it from a more sort of holistic point of view. You have to look at, well, how does a particular event affect my capital interest, my income interest, and my liability interest? And they're in this case, they're obviously connected, because if you have a major pollution incident, you're exposed to massive liabilities. So you're necessarily sort of looking to your P&I club. At the same time, you could very easily be losing income because of the extensive delays. And you want to make sure that your P&I risks, which are well taken care of, that the extra risk to your income flow, that is also covered. And you can add on that particular risk to an existing loss of hire, so that you extend your loss of hire cover so that it dovetails nicely with your P&I cover. That's the most logical thing to do. But then you may say, oh, well, I don't need traditional loss of hire, but I would like this kind of additional cover for the P&I incident.
Sure.
And this can also be done.
And one logical reasoning behind, if anyone arrives at that conclusion, it could be, I would like to insure the things that are outside of my control, whereas the issues or events that originate with something that's within my control, I am happy to run.
Yeah, so that's a very good point.
Yeah, I think one thing's for certain, Baltimore has already happened, and the next incident is not going to look identical.
No.
But I hope we've shed some light on what can happen and what the remedies are. And should you have any questions relating to something we've said, please contact your Lockton Marine contact. And maybe the question will make its way to us, Nick.
Yeah, well, let's hope so. Questions about these kind of things are always interesting.
And we look forward to welcoming you next time on the Lockton Marine Podcast. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.